There's a bridge on the southern coast of Croatia that shouldn't exist the way it does. European taxpayers paid for it. A Chinese state company built it. And on the day it opened, with fireworks over the water and a hypercar rolling across the deck, the name everyone repeated wasn't Brussels. It was Beijing. So how does that happen? How does the European Union spend the better part of €500 million, run a fair and open competition, and still end up handing its most visible trophy in the Balkans to its single biggest economic rival? To understand that, you have to start with a problem so strange it almost sounds invented. For about 300 years, Croatia was a country you could not drive across without leaving it. Picture the map. The Croatian coast runs down the Adriatic in a long, thin ribbon, and near the bottom, just before you reach Dubrovnik, the ribbon gets cut. A small wedge of land, only about 9 kilometers wide, pushes down to the sea and belongs to a different country entirely, Bosnia and Herzegovina. That wedge is called the Neum Corridor, and it is Bosnia's one and only stretch of coastline. It's the reason that, for generations, a Croatian family driving south to Dubrovnik would hit a border checkpoint, leave their own country, drive a few minutes through Bosnia, then hit a second checkpoint and re-enter the country they never meant to leave. 2 passport controls, 1 short stretch of road, all to travel within a single nation. Now, where did this bizarre little gap come from? You have to go back to the year 1699 and the Treaty of Karlowitz. Back then, the coast was carved up between rival powers, and the merchant republic of Dubrovnik, nervous about its powerful neighbor Venice, deliberately handed a slice of its own land to the Ottoman Empire to sit between them as a buffer. A defensive gift. And here's the wild part. Empires rose and fell, borders were redrawn again and again, 2 world wars came and went. Yugoslavia formed and then violently broke apart, and through all of it, that one thin strip stayed put. When Bosnia became independent, the corridor came with it. The buffer outlived everyone who created it. For a long time, this was just an inconvenience, an annoying pause on a summer road trip. Then, in 2013, everything changed, because Croatia joined the European Union. And that turned a local quirk into a genuine problem. Croatia now wanted into the Schengen zone, the passport-free travel area that binds much of Europe together. But Schengen has hard rules about controlling your external borders, and suddenly those 2 little checkpoints inside Croatia were an external frontier of the entire European Union, sitting right in the middle of a member state's own territory. Ambulances, freight trucks, tour buses, all of them still queuing, still being stamped, still crawling through in the peak of summer when the wait could stretch for hours. It was, frankly, embarrassing. A country that could theoretically travel freely across a whole continent still couldn't travel freely across itself. So Croatia decided to do something it had dreamed about for decades: build a bridge. Not a modest one either. A crossing that would leap from the mainland at Kamarna out over the sea, skip the Bosnian coast entirely by staying in Croatian waters, and land on the Pelješac Peninsula, from where a road could carry you down to Dubrovnik without a single border check. On paper, it solved everything. The only question was, who would pay for it, because a project like this is brutally expensive. And this is where Europe steps in. In 2017, the European Commission approved €357 million from its cohesion funds. That's money specifically designed to help newer members catch up to the rest of the bloc. That grant would cover 85% of the construction cost, the maximum the rules allow, with the total project, including all the access roads, tunnels, and bypasses, eventually climbing past €420 million, and by some accounts, well beyond 500 million once everything was counted. It was one of the largest single infrastructure investments in Croatia's history. And because it was EU money, the law was strict. The contract had to go to open tender. Any qualified company on Earth was allowed to bid. 3 serious contenders stepped forward. There was Strabag, the Austrian giant, a firm that had spent decades building tunnels and railways across Central Europe. There was an Italian-Turkish partnership. And there was the China Road and Bridge Corporation, a state-owned enterprise that answers, ultimately, to the Chinese government. When the sealed bids were opened, the European firms landed in roughly the same neighborhood, around 340 to 350 million euros. And then came the Chinese number, 278 million euros. That undercut the next cheapest offer by roughly 20%. On a project of this size, that isn't a small saving, that's a chasm. And on top of the lower price, the Chinese consortium also promised to finish the whole thing 6 months faster than required. Strabag did not take it quietly. The Austrians filed a formal complaint, essentially arguing that no private company could deliver this work at these prices without hidden state support propping up a loss. It's a serious accusation, and it goes to the heart of a much bigger European anxiety. Because a state-owned company doesn't have to make a profit the way a private one does. It can be told to win, and it can lean on cheaper state financing, cheaper materials, and its own imported labor and equipment to get there. But here's the thing. The complaint was reviewed, the bids were judged to meet every technical requirement under EU law, and Strabag's objection was thrown out. Croatia's regulators found no rule had been broken. And so in January 2018, the contract was signed. For the first time in history, a Chinese state company had won a major public tender, co-financed by the European Union, inside the European Union, using European money. Now, this is not a random win. It fits a pattern. The bridge became a visible piece of China's Belt and Road Initiative, a vast global program of ports, roads, and railways stretching across a huge number of countries, financed by Chinese banks and built by Chinese contractors. Its influence delivered in concrete. And for Beijing, a gleaming bridge in a European Union member state, paid for mostly by Brussels, was about the best advertisement money couldn't buy. Which brings us to the part that actually matters if you care about engineering. Because whatever you think of the politics, what happened next in the water was genuinely extraordinary. Construction began in July 2018, and the crews immediately ran into the ground, or rather, the near total lack of solid ground. The bay looks calm and shallow from above. Beneath the surface, it's a nightmare. The seabed here is layered with soft, waterlogged clay that has almost no ability to hold weight. And the hard limestone bedrock you actually need to build on can lie as deep as 100 meters below the seafloor. To anchor a 2.5-kilometer bridge on top of that, you cannot just pour foundations. You have to drive enormous steel tubes, roughly 2 meters across, straight down through, all of it until they hit rock. And these piles broke records. The longest one measured 130.6 meters and weighed around 255 tons. To this day, that stands as a world record for the longest steel pile ever driven in civil engineering. Getting them into place required the largest pile-driving barge on the planet at the time, a floating monster that had to be shipped over from China. In total, the piles alone accounted for more than 30,000 tons of steel, and the whole structure swallowed well over 65,000 tons. But raw size wasn't even the hardest part. Remember, this bay isn't empty water. It's one of Europe's most treasured shellfish regions, a protected marine reserve where oyster farms have operated for centuries. And slamming giant steel tubes into the seabed with a hydraulic hammer creates underwater shockwaves powerful enough to kill marine life outright. So, how do you build here without wiping out the very thing that makes the place special? The answer is beautifully simple. Before any hammering began, the crews laid a ring of perforated pipe around the work zone and pumped compressed air through it, creating a curtain of rising bubbles that completely surrounded the site. Sound behaves very differently in air than in water, so that wall of bubbles scattered and absorbed the shock waves before they could spread across the bay. The oysters survived. The farms kept producing. The engineering worked around the ecology instead of steamrolling it. Then there's the wind. This part of the Adriatic is famous for the bora, a fierce, gusting wind that can hammer the coast at speeds approaching 180 kilometers an hour. A wind like that doesn't just shove a bridge sideways. It can set the deck oscillating, building a rhythm that, if you let it, can eventually tear a structure apart. So the deck was shaped almost like an aircraft wing. A streamlined steel box with aerodynamic edges designed to break up those swirling forces before they could build into something dangerous. And the cables were ribbed for the very same reason. And it all held. The bridge opened on the 26th of July, 2022, ahead of schedule and under its revised budget, a genuinely impressive feat. Most Croatians knew a Chinese company had built it. Far fewer stopped to remember that Europe had paid for it. And for Beijing, that's not an accident. That's the whole point. So, a triumph, then? Well, hold on, because the story took a turn. In October 2024, barely 2 years after opening, routine inspections found something nobody wants to see on a brand new bridge. Cracks spreading across the surface of several of the concrete pylons. Now the authorities were quick to stress, and independent engineers agreed that these are surface cracks, not structural ones. The bridge is stable. It is safe to drive across. But in a marine environment, surface cracks are not harmless because they're doorways. Salt spray carries chloride into those tiny gaps. Chloride reaches the steel reinforcement hidden inside the concrete, and steel that starts corroding expands and slowly breaks the concrete apart from within. A bridge designed to last 100 years can have that lifespan quietly eaten away. And the cause? It turns out to be almost mundane. Investigators traced it to plastic shrinkage, which is a fancy way of saying the young concrete wasn't properly protected as it cured. Out in the open, under the hard Dalmatian sun, the surface water evaporated far too quickly, and the concrete cracked as it dried. A rushed, or at least imperfect, curing process on a structure that was otherwise a marvel. The repair is scheduled for late 2026. Crews will grind back the damaged surface to the reinforcement beneath, rebuild it, and seal it with a protective marine-grade coating to keep the Adriatic out. And here's the detail that closes the loop on this entire saga. Who pays for those repairs? Not the Croatian taxpayer. The Chinese contractor provided a 10-year warranty, so every euro of that repair bill lands back on Beijing's builders. So, sit with the full picture for a second. A bridge dreamed of for 3 centuries to solve a border drawn by an empire that no longer exists. Financed by European taxpayers. Built faster and cheaper than anyone in Europe could match by a Chinese state company. Celebrated as a jewel of Beijing's global ambitions, and now quietly patched up, on China's own dime, inside a protected European nature reserve. Depending on where you sit, this is either a masterclass in getting infrastructure built, or a slow-motion warning about who gets to build Europe's future when Europe writes the check. The bridge itself is a genuine engineering triumph. What it represents is a lot harder to settle. So, what do you think? Was the Pelješac Bridge a smart, pragmatic deal that got a vital crossing built on time and on budget? Or was it a strategic misstep that let a rival plant its flag in the middle of the European Union with the EU's own money? I'd love to hear where you land on that in the comments. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, where engineering and geopolitics collide, do hit that like button and subscribe, because there are plenty more of these stories to tell.